Hi everyone. Firstly, apologies. We've got a couple of technical problems, so we've got our cameras off at the moment just to save our bandwidth. But let me start by saying welcome to our Simpler Recycling legislation webinar held in partnership with Veolia. For anyone that doesn't know me, recognise you can't see me, but I'm Paddy Gamble, Director of Insights and Strategy at New West End Company, and I lead sort of our innovation work stream, which includes data analytics insight, but all things sustainability here at NWEC. Before we begin, I'd like to take time to introduce the presenters joining me this morning. Today we'll be hearing from Beth Gordon, who is Delivery Lead of Simpler Recycling at the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. We'll also have Mandy Langstaff, a Senior Advisor at the Environment Agency. And last but not least, James Mason, who's the Sustainability and Portfolio Manager for Westminster at Veolia. Together, they will be talking us through the Simpler Recycling new legislation, which is due to come in force soon. From Monday, the 31st of March, all businesses with more than 10 employees will have to comply with new legislation, which requires the separation of glass, plastic, metal, paper, card, and food waste from general waste. The updated policy is being introduced by the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs and aims to simplify waste collection and improve recycling rates nationwide. So, to help you prepare and ultimately ensure compliance before the deadline, today's webinar is dedicated to explaining the new legislation and its impact on your business. At the end, we'll open the conversation for Q&A, so please do pop any questions you have in the chat box on screen as we go through or at the end, and we'll endeavour to answer all of them. Enough from me. I'll now hand over to Beth and Mandy to take you through the new rules.
Thank you very much, Paddy, and thank you to everyone for joining today. So I just want to give you a brief outline about the new regulations known as Simpler Recycling, which applies to workplaces in England. Next slide, please. So currently there is actually no legal requirement on businesses and non-domestic premises to separate dry recycling or food waste. The minimum requirement is obviously that you manage your waste appropriately. So Simpler Recycling changes this. So what we call business and relevant non-domestic premises, which we've renamed workplaces just for ease and for understanding, will have to separately present what we call household-like waste into a number of different streams. So there'll be a dry recycling stream, food waste and residual waste, and I'll go into a bit more detail shortly and just explain how those work. And as the workplace, you must present your waste in accordance with the arrangements agreed with the waste collector. So the actual dates for implementation, so as Paddy's mentioned, from the 31st of March 2025, small, medium and large workplaces need to make arrangements to recycle all these waste streams. And then from the 31st of March 2027, microfirms will need to recycle all waste streams. And also in 2027, all workplaces will need to recycle plastic films. And just to explain, a microfirm is classed as a business that has less than 10 full-time equivalent employees. So if you're a very small business, then that would obviously apply for you and you have an extra 2 years to comply. Next slide, please. So why are we doing this? One of the questions we often get asked. Obviously, the government wants to reduce the amount of waste going to landfill and incineration, reducing associated carbon emissions and supporting net zero targets, and obviously increasing the overall recycling rate. Obviously, we want to reduce carbon emissions as a result of reduced production from virgin materials. It's also about supporting the growth of the UK recycling and industry and creating green jobs. And the Secretary of State, obviously, one of his priorities is the circular economy. So this is about underpinning that transition where we keep our resources in use for longer and waste is reduced. Next slide, please. So just in a bit more detail, what we mean about workplaces. So like I said, it's both businesses and relevant non-domestic premises. So non-domestic premises are things like charity shops, public meeting places, places of worship, education, and then obviously the business side is your normal sort of retail, hospitality, shops, businesses, all those different types of sort of shops and businesses. As part of this, obviously, there are a number of stakeholders. There's your private waste collectors, for instance, Veolia, who obviously arrange collections at the minute. There are local authorities that also do collections from workplaces. The Environment Agency, who will be the regulator, which Mandy will explain more detail about later. And then trade associations, who obviously are working with their members to help communicate and inform them of the changes in legislation. Next slide, please. So this is about how it works in practice and how you need to present your work. So there is a minimum collection service that workplace should have, but this is just a minimum, and you can opt for further segregation. So in terms of what we're expecting is that dry mixed recycling, which is glass, metal and plastics, will be in one container, paper and card in another, food waste in another, and then residual waste in your final container. However, there is you are allowed in legislation to do what's called a co-collection assessment. So the waste collector can do this, and that provides them, they can use an exception so that they can collect dry recycling and paper and card together, but they have to meet one of the criteria in the legislation, which is about that it's not technically practicable to collect it separately, it's not economically practical to collect it separately, or there is no significant environmental benefit. And the waste collector will prepare that co-collection assessment, and obviously then they will collect in with a commingled collection from the relevant premises. Just because this is the sort of minimum collection service, that doesn't mean that you can't further separate. So for instance, there's a lot of businesses where they maybe generate a lot of glass, sometimes have a separate glass collection because that's more economic value for them. Or it might be that you generate a lot of cardboard and you just want that collected separately because you bale it and stuff. So this is about the minimum, but there is flexibility within it so that businesses can make their collections to suit their circumstances. Next slide, please. So one of the questions we get asked quite a bit is around food waste, because this is obviously a new requirement, but actually not a lot of businesses currently have food waste. So it applies to all food waste generated on a site that needs to be separated for recycling, and you shouldn't be asking your staff to take your food waste home. It does apply to all workplaces regarding whether there are catering facilities provided to staff or not. So it's not just about capturing those with a canteen, it's about all offices, all workplaces. And just to clarify, there is no minimum weight threshold for food waste. So it doesn't matter how much you produce, you're still expected to have a collection. However, we have left flexibility within the legislation so that businesses can decide their own collection frequency according to the amount of food waste they generate. But what we would like to promote, obviously, is that the food and drink waste hierarchy is followed. So actually, we try and prevent food waste where possible, and that if surplus food does arise, that workplaces give priority to redistributing it for human consumption or sending it for animal feed over disposal through food waste recycling. Next slide, please. So I suppose one of the questions we get asked is about what is the support out there for businesses, for waste collectors, for local authorities, and what we're doing to make people aware of the different requirements. So we've published on .gov.uk a communications toolkit that has things like frequently asked questions, checklists for waste collectors and businesses, like a one-page flyer just explaining the changes to the legislation, and that's all there. And there is a form there. If there's anything else you think that would be helpful for us to provide, you can fill that in to give us that feedback. We've also worked with our delivery partners, WRAP, to develop a business of recycling website. This is more specifically aimed at actual workplaces, and it's got a range of different guidance and tools that you can download or information available. There's frequently asked collections. There's a business waste calculator to look at the costs. There is posters you can download to use in your business. And there's information and advice on how to do a waste audit, so you understand the waste your business is generating and what actual collections you need. And that's all there, and that's available for anybody to utilise. Next slide, please. And then obviously we're doing all these specific webinars at all sorts of different events with different partners and stakeholders. We're also using our social media channels to promote this through things like LinkedIn, and WRAP are also promoting it through their social media channels. And we're just trying to spread the message as wide as possible, so that businesses are aware of what they need to do going forward. And I'm now going to hand over to Mandy. Thank you.
Thanks, Beth. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to come and speak to you today. My name is Mandy Langstaff and I work for the Environment Agency. And if you haven't come across us before, we are the environmental regulator for England. And we deliver our role through 6 key functions, which are regulating land and air pollution, enforcing waste regulations, fisheries, recreation and navigation, flood risk management, conservation and biodiversity, water quality and water resources. We also have an incident role and respond to anything that could have an impact on the environment. So that could be flooding, fire on an industrial estate, or a spillage polluting a watercourse. Next slide, please. So I'm here today to speak to you about how the Environment Agency is going to regulate the simpler recycling requirements. So as a regulator, we are required to have regard to the Regulators Code, which requires us to support growth, engage with business, take a risk-based and proportionate approach to regulation, and to help those we regulate to get it right. The Environment Agency has a statutory duty to have regard to this code, and that's reflected in our own strategies and policies. We use advice-led regulation to secure compliance, particularly when legislation is new or changed. And the first stage is educating and raising awareness of legislative requirements. And this will be followed by providing advice and guidance on how to comply in specific situations, and eventually risk-based interventions where non-compliance is discovered. Next slide, please. So what compliance action could the Environment Agency take? We have the power to issue a compliance notice against anyone who is party to arrangements for collection of waste. Although we have this power, our first response is usually to provide advice and guidance to enable compliance, but that depends on the seriousness of the situation. If our advice and guidance is ignored, then we may serve a compliance notice specifying the failures to comply, the steps to be taken to prevent the failure from continuing or recurring, and the period within which those steps must be taken. The time frame for compliance will depend on what went wrong and the actions needed to fix it. Failure to comply with a compliance notice is an offence, and we will consider what action to take in accordance with our enforcement and sanctions policy, which is available on the internet. We can't issue on-the-spot fines or fixed penalty notices. Next slide, please. So what enforcement action can we take? We aim to make sure our enforcement response is proportionate and appropriate to each situation. Our first response is usually to give advice and guidance. So we can support businesses who has committed an offence by giving advice and guidance. Our objective is to provide an opportunity for the business to return to compliance and stay compliant. We could also issue a written warning if we believe a business has committed an offence. The warning will be kept on record, and any continued or further breach may influence our later choice of enforcement action. We can also issue something called a formal caution to deter future offending. We can only do this if the offender admits the offence and consents to be cautioned. If the offender won't accept the formal caution, then we have to prosecute for the original offence. So we can prosecute for an offence, but it's usually the last resort, and the decision to prosecute is not taken lightly. We need to be sure there is sufficient evidence and it is in the public interest to prosecute. Even then, we will consider if a different response is more appropriate. And finally, on fines, if we prosecute and secure a conviction, the offender will be subject to a fine. The level of the fine is not specified in the legislation, but is at the discretion of the court. As I mentioned previously, we cannot issue on-the-spot fines or fixed penalty notices. Next slide, please. So what is the Environment Agency doing to try and raise awareness of the simpler recycling requirements? We're attending meetings, webinars and events, both alongside and separately from DEFRA. And we're going to continue this engagement after implementation in March by working with trade bodies, business leads and others for the rest of the year. Next slide, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth and Mandy. So now we'll hand over to James to talk about the specifics for businesses within the West End and within our district. Also, just a quick reminder to pop any questions you might have for our speakers today in the chat box, and then we can sort of come back and review and answer those at the end. So over to you, James.
Thank you, Paddy, and thanks Beth and Mandy for that overview. Good morning all. I'm James Mason, as Paddy mentioned, Sustainability and Portfolio Manager for Veolia, and I work on behalf of Westminster City Council. So I look after our commercial portfolio in Westminster, which carries out the recycling services for over 5,000 businesses across the borough, but much more than that. And the key area of my role at the moment is to really drive forward our sustainability work. So facilitating our work alongside businesses in Westminster and in the New West End area, helping them to reduce their waste, increase their recycling rates, reduce carbon emissions and achieve their overall sustainability goals. At Westminster City Council, we have an emissions target for the city to reach net zero by 2040, so supporting our businesses in achieving that, and also to become a net zero council internally by 2030. So it's a massive element on our agenda, and it's the element if you ask me. And this simpler recycling legislation is really key to unlocking a more sustainable borough in regards to our resources and waste. Thanks, Izzy. We operate a full service across the borough, so we carry out collections 24/7, 365 days a year. So anything that is required by you as New West End businesses, we can facilitate. Now, just building on what Mandy and Beth have gone over today, and I won't go over it again, but these are some of the services that you have available to you in the New West End area. So all of these services are there to help you get compliant with the legislation. It's worth having a look to see what you have, to see what you don't have. Thanks, Izzy. We also have additional services for those who want to take their recycling and their sustainability impacts to the next level. Beth mentioned the plastic film, we call it the flexible plastics, that comes into legislation in 2027. But if you want to get ahead of the curve, you absolutely can do. And there's various services outside of the 31st of March 2025 deadline that's required for simpler recycling. So if you're a coffee cup producer, if you produce garden waste, even plant and hedge trimmings, whatever that might be, or electrical waste, these are available to you as well, just for your information. Thanks, Izzy. So I've broken it down into 4 really simple steps. There are some additional details here as well, but just for businesses in the New West End area, how can you implement that simpler recycling legislation? How can you ensure that you are on top of it? So the first step I've got here is the legislation awareness. And hopefully today, by attending this webinar and listening to DEFRA and the Environment Agency speak, we've completed that step. If you have any further questions or clarifications, then please feel free to ask on the chat or get in touch with us afterwards. But we should all be at step 1 by now, which is really fantastic. The second step is to contact your service provider. So have a look within your business, let your service provider know what additional services you need. So focus on what you don't have that's been outlined today. I understand that within the NWEC area, there are a number of national or international businesses. A lot of the waste services that you may have as a business in the area might be determined by your head office. That's an issue that I come across quite often when I'm working with the New West End businesses. If that is the case, it's worth putting pressure on your head office, contacting your head office to work with them and ensure they act to contact your provider to implement those services. And that leads you on to the third step, is changing that service. So working with your service provider, who should be able to take you through the easy steps to implement that service, whether it's changing the contract, adding additional bins, working with your staff to implement those bins there. If your service provider is not available to help you out, it might be worth looking at a new provider. It's not you who needs to be the expert, and I think that that's something that needs to be clear. You have your service provider who are the expert to help you make these changes, and they should be working alongside you, holding your hand to make sure you implement them effectively. And then finally, once we've implemented those services, it's all about training and education to staff. So making sure not only do you have the services, but your team and your business are using those services effectively. If you just have a recycling bin sat in your bin store that's being completely unused, then making the changes haven't really had any impact. So making sure that training to your staff is carried out. And that leads us on to some of the challenges. Thanks, Izzy. So we've seen that first, and what I believe to be the easiest step is the implementation of that new service. And that's what that'll do is ensure you're compliant. But the next step really is to optimize your recycling and your resource management. So looking at the likes of contamination, education, and space, especially in Westminster, really key elements here. You'll notice perhaps that I haven't put costs here. The reason for that is that your recycling services should always be cheaper than your general waste services. If that is not the case with your current provider, speak to them and see if they're willing to make that change. The vast majority of providers will ensure the recycling services are cheaper to ensure that we can adopt more sustainable practices. If that continues to be the case, then once again, it's worth speaking to a different provider. So the first challenge that we have is separating waste effectively. Thanks, Izzy. This is, as I mentioned, a really, really key challenge. So it's all about communication with your staff. Once you have those recycling bins implemented, we need to ensure that staff have adequate education, there's signage, there's guides, possibly color-coded bins. It's your staff who are going to be using those waste services and those new recycling services. So ensuring that communication is key. Carrying out a waste audit is a really effective management process here. So bringing in either your waste collection provider or using one of the guides that DEFRA have created to do your own waste audit is a really, really optimal option here. Thanks, Izzy. Looking at space and infrastructure, many businesses in the New West End area will be very aware of the space allocation problems. It's one of the most common issues that I see from businesses, especially working within the city. So this refers to both space within the common areas, the back of house, the front of house, but also looks at the space for your larger bin stores if you do have a bin store. So ensuring that you have the adequate space for your new services that you're going to be implementing, and getting that infrastructure right. So ensuring the bin sizes, the colours of the bins, the location of the bins is a really key challenge here. One example is removing general waste bins from office desks. I know many offices have implemented this already. It's a really, really effective way to reduce the amount of general waste that you're producing as a business. The next step is contamination. So ensuring, thanks Izzy, ensuring you're managing and measuring your contamination. A composition analysis can be carried out. A composition analysis looks at your recycling or your general waste and what you're producing. We can take that away to our expert facility where it is broken down, and a detailed report can be provided to you, which outlines all of the materials, all of the waste that you're placing into your bins, and outlines how you can reduce your general waste. And then the second option there is sorting on site. So if you really want to take your recycling and your contamination reduction to the next level, it's the second stage sorting. So once your staff have placed the recycling or the waste into the relevant bins, having additional staff to sort through those bins to ensure that you're reducing the contamination as much as possible is a key option here. And I'll go into a little bit of detail in a little bit on that one. Thanks, Izzy. Finally, I just want to touch on a case study of a business working within Westminster. You can move to the next slide, Izzy. Thank you. This is a real case study of an organisation that we've worked with. I've taken their name out of it for anonymity purposes. But in March 2023, this business had only general waste, glass and cardboard services, and their recycling rate was around 36%, which is lower than what we would want, but it's not as low as what we see across many areas of the borough. We started to work alongside them in 2023. We started to ensure that they were aware of a lot of the legislation that was coming up and we worked with them to implement a plan to increase their recycling rates. Between April and July of that year, we introduced a food waste service and a dry mix recycling service, and that allowed us to reduce their general waste services. So they went from 25 bins to just 8 bins with the addition of those recycling streams that we added, and that brought their recycling rate up to 54% just in a matter of months. Over the time since 2023, they've worked very, very hard to implement additional services and additional recycling bins within their site, and now their recycling is at over 95%. Speaking to that team, they determined the success of the initiative to be based on education, working closely with staff, ensuring that they are trained on how to recycle correctly, implementing color-coded bins within their communal areas, and getting the staff on board of the hotel sustainability journey. The staff there are really interested in ensuring that they are producing as little general waste as possible and to work to improve the sustainability of the hotel. And just to give you an overview, Izzy, if you can move to the next slide, please, of what the service changes have looked like. So in March 2023, that top table there that you have is what their initial service was when we started to work alongside them. And you can see in October of last year, the additional service that they implemented to bring about a 95% recycling rate. Now, one thing I will mention is 95% is almost unheard of. They've done an amazing job at this hotel. One other thing I'd like to mention is that in March 2023, their service, this is a very large hotel, was around £115,000 per year for those 3 services that they have on that top dark blue table. The service that they have on the bottom table is inclusive of an additional hotel that they've brought on. So they've doubled the waste, or they've doubled the waste that they're producing. But because of the implementation of those recycling streams, they were able to reduce it down to £65,000. So they reduced it by almost half by implementing those additional recycling streams. Something else that they've been able to do is transform their bin room into a recycling centre. So reducing again even further that general waste and implementing that second stage contamination management that we referenced a little bit earlier. The savings from reducing the costs of their waste service by reducing their general waste allowed them to employ a particular employee who was able to take on the management of the bin room and to optimize that recycling rate up to 95%. Thanks, Izzy. Next slide. I won't dwell on this slide for too much longer. It's what's been covered within these slides and by Beth and Mandy as well, but just ensuring those 6 steps to recycling success is legislation awareness. This is from the hotel in particular, implementing food waste services, composition analysis to really understand in depth what sort of waste you're producing, and expanding into the further recycling streams that are available to you, and ensuring that staff are trained and aware of what needs to be done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Beth, Mandy, and James, for taking us through the new legislation and how the businesses can prepare. And now we'll open the floor to questions. So one of the first ones was, will you get the content? Yes, you'll see my contact details come in a second. Please just drop me an email, and we can forward that on in terms of sort of obtaining the slides that everyone's taken us through. So maybe if I step through the questions. Firstly, someone's asked about Tetra Pak. So it wasn't mentioned on the 6th slide. So I think this is probably one for Beth or Mandy. There's lots of this around now that, particularly with milk alternatives are so popular. Where should that waste be going?
Okay, thanks, Paddy. So first thing I'd say is check the back of the pack to see whether the material is recyclable or not, because some types of composite packaging aren't. So if they're coated with plastic on both sides, for example, they're not recyclable. So check if it is recyclable, and then it should go. If it is recyclable, it should go in the plastic waste stream.
Thank you. The next question is WEE. So is this included within the legislation?
So waste electricals,
Yeah.
not at the moment, no.
And then it sounds like events and or weekend markets are not counted within the legislation. If not, how will we ensure that the recycling levels at these is this to come in future?
So yes, they are included in the legislation. Markets are classified as producing commercial waste. So if they're producing waste that's household-like, then they would be captured within the legislation this year.
Okay, thank you. I mentioned the slide deck. What exactly should the waste service providers be doing to help us?
I can jump in and answer that one. There's various different areas that waste providers should be working alongside businesses in this sense. As I mentioned towards the start of the presentation, the waste providers are the experts in this area. So what they should be doing at the very least is providing you with information on what you need to do to change. So what additional service you need to implement as a business to ensure that you're compliant with this legislation. They will have what your service looks like on their systems. I'm sure you will have that as well, but they'll be able to easily find out what you need to add, what you need to change to ensure that you're compliant. The next step for that is the additional support that your waste collection provider should be able to provide to you. So that can include education of your staff. So for us at Veolia, educating businesses, carrying out sessions alongside them in person or online, or however it is that a business would require that sort of engagement. That's part of the service, and it's included within the single price that a business might be paying. It's never going to be additional. So it's that hand holding, that education to ensure that not only do you have a service the way you're recycling, but that service is being used effectively. There's also waste audits that your provider should be carrying out for you. You have those templates that are available from DEFRA, so you can carry them out yourself. But once again, you don't need to be the experts here. You have the experts on hand to provide you with that guidance. So carrying out those waste audits and those compositional analysis and really providing you with any support that you require. So please do lean on your waste collection provider for any help that you need. If you have any questions, have any thoughts after this webinar, then please do get in touch with them and they should be able to help you.
Thank you. I think we've got one final question there about, is bubble wrap recyclable?
Hi, yes, bubble wrap is recyclable but it will need to go in the plastic film stream when that starts to be collected in 2027. And there's a full list of the waste streams that are included in the Separation of Waste England Regulations 2024. I think Beth's put a link as answer to one of the questions in as well.
Thank you. That could be Guiney. Will there be any government training that can ensure store teams sort of are fully up to speed and knowledgeable of the changes? So for retailers out there, in terms of training their staff, what support is available?
Thanks. Obviously, we're doing the support through these webinars and through trade associations. We're not providing specific training because obviously each the type of waste they produce and how their store's laid out and how they need to adapt to do that. So we're trying to provide the overarching information on, you know, what needs to be recycled, what waste streams, but we're actually leaving it up to the individual businesses to assess how that needs to be rolled out in their own premises.
But yes, thank you for joining. Thank you for everyone that's taken time to listen to the presentations.